Greetings and hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's special edition with Building Power. I'm your host, Zakiya Sankara-Jabar, and today we are bringing up our final Seeking Common Ground virtual town hall series that we have been bringing to you all every Wednesday at noon. So we're excited again today for this conversation. We have a group of panelists, of course, again, that's going to help us have a conversation around supporting the whole child in a post-pandemic world. So that's very real. Schools are open, I believe, in most parts of the country back in person. And so we want to talk about what those transitions look like, what kind of supports, not just the students need, but of course, staff, just the entire school community working to ensure that the whole child is being serviced in this kind of post-pandemic, I believe, world, but we still kind of sort of in a pandemic. It's a lot happening. So a couple of housekeeping things. Welcome, first of all. We're glad that you all are here. Can you hit the thumbs up button or the like button, depending if you're watching us from Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube, and then share this broadcast. Just like last week, we want to make sure that we have an interactive conversation. We welcome your questions. Make sure that you put your questions in the comment section. And towards the end of our 90 minutes together today, we will bring up a few of those questions and have our panelists of experts respond to them. But without further ado, I want to bring up our illustrious panel today. We have some amazing folks here today who are absolutely experts and are going to help us make sense of what's happening in our schools and in communities today. So welcome, everybody. I want to toss it to my good friend, Cierra, first. Cierra, welcome to this Citizen Ed broadcast. We're excited to have you. Please introduce yourself to our audience.
Thank you so much for having me, Zakiya. I'm really thrilled to be a part of this conversation. I know that the questions that we'll explore together today, I've been thinking about a lot, so really looking forward to being in virtual community with you all. I am Cierra Kaler-Jones. My pronouns are she and her. I'm a community-based researcher that uses participatory and creative methodologies in my work. I've been a teacher for over 10 years. My roots are in dance and arts education, but I've also taught classes in US history, social change and leadership, and public policy. My heart's work includes co-facilitating and dreaming up a program alongside young people that uses art and education to fuel social change through the co-creation of healing-centered spaces for and with Black girls and transgender non-conforming young people. I'm the director of storytelling at Communities for Just Schools Fund, and we're a donor collaborative that resources community organizing across North America for racial justice. Again, so grateful to be here and looking forward to the conversation today.
Yes, thank you so much. Jason, welcome, and please introduce yourself to the audience.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jason Allen, a 17-year veteran educator. Currently teaching special education at Seven Pillars Career Academy. I'm a part of the Brightbeam family as I direct and lead EdLanta as well as the EdLanta Student Coalition. And I'm honored to actually have one of our EdLanta student leaders who is on, but also one of my students. And so it's twofold for me. And of course, as an educator here in the city of Atlanta, I'm also running for school board. So for our Seven Pillars family that's watching and all those a part of EdLanta in Georgia, thank you for tuning in and supporting such a powerful conversation.
And you have so many of my heroes on your wall. I always enjoy our meetings with you, Jason, because I get to see my heroes and sheroes. And speaking of your student, Jovan, welcome. We're excited to have you. Introduce yourself.
Hey everyone, I am Jovan Manning. I am currently an 8th grade student at Seven Pillars Career Academy. I've been a part of the EdLanta Student Coalition since 7th grade, and I'm really excited to be a part of this and see how everyone thinks about this.
Yes, we're excited to have you. And last but not least, welcome, Robin. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. It's such a pleasure to join you all today. My name is Robin Lake, and I direct the Center on Reinventing Public Education. We're a research and policy center located in Seattle, Washington, but we do national work, and we've been around for 30 years studying all things relating to equity and innovation in public education, trying to find new pathways to serve every kid to his or her full potential. During the pandemic, we've done a big pivot and just tried to understand what do students and families need and want, how are school systems responding, and also what are the kind of the breakthrough innovations that we need to watch for during this time that can inform a better public education system going forward. So happy to join you.
Necessary work. Thank you. I'm really excited about talking to you guys today. So let's just hop right into some questions, right? Just real quick, if you guys in the audience are just joining us, we want to welcome you. We want to ask you to hit the thumbs up button, hit the like button, and also share this in your social media circles. We want to have an interactive conversation with each and every one of you. We also welcome your questions, and we will have your questions up towards the end of our 90 minutes together, and we'll toss them to our expert panelists here to answer them for you. So our first question for our panel is, what do we know about the social and emotional state of kids after an 18-month plus, and maybe continuing, pandemic? Cierra, I want to start with you.
Oh, thank you. So I can only speak to what I've heard from the young people that I get to work with. And what I've heard from them is that they are just holding so much. They are in a pivotal aspect of their growth, their development, and exploration of self and of community. And there's so much individual and collective grief, continued racial injustice, a climate crisis. The list goes on and on and on. And so what we know is that we have to create spaces that are really centered in healing. Dr. Monique Morris said that schools have to be spaces of healing before they can become spaces of learning. So I know as an educator how critical it is for us to create spaces for deep conversation, for reflection, and ultimately healing. And this will be an ongoing challenge for all of us. So we have to really figure out how we must continue to support young people.
Absolutely. Robin, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Same question.
Sure. Well, we've been tracking the research, and I think what the research is telling us is it's still emerging. It's going to take a while to really understand what the heck just happened to kids and what are the short and long-term impacts. But the research really reinforces what Cierra is saying, that all kids suffered during the pandemic, even if it was just from social isolation and missing their friends and not having the normal rites of passage of high school and things like that. But we also know that a significant portion of young people, probably 30 to 40%, it's coming through in the research and surveys and things like that, really experience pretty negative impacts on their mental or social emotional health during the pandemic. And I'll just give you a little bit of a deep dive into that. So if you look at the rates of anxiety, attempted suicides, those rates were already on the rise pre-pandemic, but they definitely appear to increase for students during the pandemic. And that was, for some reason, especially true among girls, which is a little bit interesting. But just a couple of data points. So the CDC put out a report saying that emergency room visits related to mental health among young people, 12 to 17-year-olds or so, increased by 31%. That's pretty huge from 2019 to 2020. And the suspected suicide attempts among girls were up 51% by March 2021, a year after schools were first closed. So, we have to hold, I think, two truths: that all kids experience something, some kids experience some severe realities. And then, aside from the things that we typically consider mental health, there's a whole raft of other things that every parent knows and is observing in their kids, that just absenteeism, low engagement, boredom, lack of motivation was just really on the rise. And behavioral issues, just, things that are ways that kids express the stress and anxieties in them are way up in our schools this year. These are anecdotal. It's hard to get the hard numbers on them, but it's a tricky time. And we were talking just before the show about, in some ways this year is harder than last year because all this stuff is coming out, and we're trying to be back to normal, but we're not there yet. So, the bottom line is, the pandemic affected every kid differently. Every kid had a different experience. We need to recognize that and plan for it. And I'll just end on a positive note too, that what we also know is that some kids found relief during the pandemic, that being away from a bullying situation, a situation where they were experiencing racism in their schools or other tensions, that they had a little bit of relief from that, and we need to really think about that and respect it and think about what it means as we try to get back to normal. And I guess the final note of positivity is we also know kids are really resilient, that they may have had a positive discovery, they may have had a negative experience, but right now they're processing all of that, and kind of we need to, as Cierra says, give them the space for healing, but also expressing what they need going forward so we can do better by them.
That was a lot. And I'm like sitting here, little glistening eye, because as you were talking, Robin, you were literally describing like my own, my son actually. And we talked about that before we came live. And I'm just wondering if just a quick follow-up for you, Robin, based on what you're talking about, and that those horrible numbers that you cited also made me, really teary-eyed, because I'm like, man, these poor children, and to think about the state of, or the lack of a really good mental health infrastructure in our country, especially if you're poor, or already part of a colonized community in any sort of way. Do you have any thoughts or or is there any research out there about how schools themselves, like the administrators and teachers even, could be supporting students who are having these issues, trying to come back in? And like you said, everybody's rushing to get back to normal.
Yes, there's a ton of research, what we know about what works generally for reengaging kids. And then there's some things that we're learning in the pandemic because it's such a focal point for us. The bottom line is really relationships, that, you can talk about all the programs in the world, and I'm happy to name some as we're going along. We can talk about specific strategies, but what we hear over and over again from kids and from educators is we need to rebuild relationships. And, when kids were in the virtual space, educators found that relationships were critical to keep them engaged and motivated and to know what was happening with them. And now we need to figure out how to carry that forward into our normal operating procedures in school and get better at, building those relationships. There are lots of tools like surveys and things, but none of it matters if kids don't have somebody to turn to in the school and talk to if something's coming up from that. And what they're reporting through survey after survey is they have not had that during the pandemic, and they really didn't have that before the pandemic.
Yeah, thank you. Jovan, this is a good time to hear from you. I would love to hear your thoughts. Same question. How do you think your school or schools can be supporting you and your peers better?
From this pandemic, most of us have been like anxious, stressed, overwhelmed, but for the most part, some going through depression, lack of communication throughout peers. Everything seemed impersonal. We're used to hanging out and going to school, having fun, but now we have masks, video calls, and a lot of unnecessary work instead of schoolwork.
Oh, wow. Unnecessary work instead of schoolwork.
Yeah.
Do you think that schools are from your perspective, right? Has your school like kind of like, okay, you know, we're back to school, you know, everything is regular now, let's get right back to work? Was there a sort of transition period before you guys kind of like just jumped right
Before
in?
we even came to school, they try to make sure that we were able to have our mental health together, make sure that we have nothing going on. If we needed help, we can go talk to our social workers at the school, any teachers that we could trust. But for that, that's the only transition period we ever had since we came back from the pandemic.
Yeah, that's actually good to hear. I'm glad that that was definitely considered, and thank you for sharing that. Jason, I'd love to hear your perspective as well as an educator. What have you been seeing?
It has been difficult. You know, during the first year, the onset of the pandemic, we lost a student. And so Jovan and my students saw me at it because I'm not a crier like that. And I don't do that, right? Mr. Allen is all about we're gonna learn, we're gonna have a good time. And so they actually got a chance to see me in a very, as well as our staff and our leadership, in very vulnerable spaces. It's really hard to have lost a student in the pandemic and not be able to have a funeral for them or be there, right? To have that closure. And so my mind automatically goes to students when we talk about mental health and the trauma that has happened. Um, Losing a peer during the pandemic, we have lost fellow teachers and staff members who are not coming back. And that is a reality. How are we bridging the gap for our students, our families who have lost loved ones, and also our school cultures? And to be quite honest, we were already at a deficit. We were already in a crisis, a shortage of teachers. We were already at a shortage of counselors and social workers and crisis intervention staff members that will be able to support us with this. So now think about the surplus of students who are experiencing trauma in different ways. But I also want to highlight this. We never really talk about our students who were missing before, our students who were in homes and they were struggling with domestic violence and domestic abuse that only heightened during the pandemic, students who are going through the coming of age process and they are learning to identify differently with their sexuality, and now they have been outcast and they aren't showing up. And so one of the conversations that I have with my students, as I frequently listen to Lauryn Hill, it hits differently when that roll call comes and we're hearing students' names who are no longer there, or having to go back and change schedules of teachers and staff members who are no longer with us. And so the trauma isn't something that we just put a Band-Aid on. It doesn't just go away. And so a solution that I have found that works is the art of storytelling and helping us all to cope with the things that have happened. Now you will notice I don't say my student's name because that's a whole nother dynamic in being able to speak the name, because it's like a fresh wound that's still open. But there is a book. I always have a resource, right? There is a book, We Do This Till We Free Us. And this is something that, again, the Brightbeam family is using. And it helps us exemplify and accelerate the voices of those who are telling stories. And storytelling is something that I feel like is very powerful during this time to help us, as to Jovan spoke, to rebuild relationships, because there has been some gaps, there have been changes. And so we all, as educators, as parents, as students, we have to learn how to re-engage with one another. We have to learn how to share and also embrace stories. And so the art of storytelling is something that definitely has worked to help me bridge the gap as a special education teacher and also an educator in this fight. So again, here's the book, everyone. We Do This Till We Free Us. There's so many stories from fellow activists and leaders who are actually doing the very work that's needed in our schools, connecting, building relationships, making the changes that are needed so that we aren't seeing the inequities continued in our schools. And so this is just an example of how we can build better relationships by telling our stories and sharing them.
Yes, come with the resources, Jason. I love that, and you're absolutely right about storytelling. Storytelling certainly does have a healing component. And I'm glad that you found that that's something that works for you and your students in your space. I also heard, and it's so true, like just building relationships again. It's hard to do that over a computer for an entire year, and you're supposed to be doing school. But that whole relationship piece is really critical, especially for our students, especially those, as you mentioned, going through transitions and just, coming into themselves. That's so important. Next question I wanted to ask all of you on the panel is, what kinds of learning can schools put in place to support them? What kind of learning, right, can schools put in place to support the students? And I'll come back to you, Jason, for that.
All right, one more time, Zakiya. I was reading the comments.
It's no problem. What kind of, you're in the school now, that's why I wanted to come to you first. What kinds of learnings can schools put in place to be supporting the students?
Okay, so I have a lot. However, I won't go into all of them, but the very first thing is this: art education. In Atlanta, there has been a very strong debate around defunding art education in our schools. And we hear board members say they value art education, but recently we have been celebrating homecoming, and there have literally been 20 students at minimum in the high school bands. And I can't wrap my mind around it, because when I was in the band, there were 20 members in the saxophone section. So 20 members in the entire band is something that is beyond me. However, what the students in EdLanta have spoken to is that they have to pay fees to be in the band, and then get your own instrument, and then pay for your uniforms to be clean and all of those things. And I'm like, I had to ask my daddy. I was like, Daddy, you had to pay for all of this when we were in school? And it's different now. I'm mentioning art education because as a special education teacher, I know all too well that I have exceptional learners that thrive in that area. So now imagine being someone who's a visual art learner, who thrives in visual art. You're a graphic designer, as we see so many amazing designs being dropped right now on this live virtual town hall, but not having an outlet to do that, or having a fee. It's almost like we're taxing our students, right, in schools to be in the Student Government Association and having to get their own uniforms. And you can be in the Beta Club, but you have to pay to get the jackets. I have to bring up the young ladies at Douglas High School who qualified to be in honor societies and Beta Club and in student government, but could not participate because they could not afford the fees. And the city of Atlanta, they didn't do a story to feature these young ladies who were making, their own barrettes and their headbands to sell and be creative about how they had to do this. We focused on the young boys and criminalized them and made our young people the cause of increasing crime in our city, only to come and find out months later that that's not the case. And so we took money away from art education, and then we criminalized our students for not being able to participate in after-school programs and other student activities. And so here's what I would say, bottom line: if we're going to really support our students with social emotional learning, then we need to invest in the things that are going to help them to grow and develop socially, emotionally, and even behavior-wise. And that starts with arts education. They need to be able to participate in activities that will allow them to also connect with careers that a lot of times are not even connected to our programming. And so to your question, we have to invest in art education as just one area to help us with really bridging the gap with building relationships and doing what is needed for our students who are not even getting the resources that they need for the ways that they learn.
Woo-wee, that's so true. I can't believe, I don't think when I was in high school, we had to pay fees and like buy our own instruments and things like that. It makes me wonder, what is the city of Atlanta doing with the school budget? Because lots of times the school budget
follow the dollars
bigger than the city's budget. That's how it was in Dayton.
Well, we'll say that we want to keep students safe, right? So EdLanta Student Coalition leaders, and shout out to Tanisha and the TDRS family that's watching. The Carver students, we showed the clip. They went to the Board of Education and said, listen, you all wouldn't listen to us. And shout out to Tanisha, who is, supporting our activism. She said, y'all need to do a TikTok video. The students got together, they did a TikTok video and exposed the Atlanta Board of
Love
Education
it.
because we have mold and mildew in our schools. So think about this. We're in a pandemic trying to come out of it, right? Everyone is wearing masks because we see my student Jovan has a mask on. But then you have mold and mildew in your building so much that the walls, the paint in the walls is starting to fall off. This was on our podcast. And we're saying that, oh, we're spending money on building infrastructure and security. Well, then most of that money is going to the school resource officers in that department. It's not going to the public safety department. So I would even be okay if the Board of Education said, you know what, let us do a public safety department to better utilize this $2.5 million. I'm not saying get rid of the officers because we need support in large events that we have. We've seen that we need support there, right? But also using those dollars as a way to say, okay, you know what, let's hire more social workers and more counselors and more behavior interventionists that can actually spend time with small groups of students,
That's right.
making sure that we're working through this. But also, why don't we expand our homeless liaisons? Because I haven't even gotten a chance to talk about the homeless students that we're not even talking about. No one, there's no campaign, well, except for the EdLanta Student Coalition. There's no campaign other than what we're doing to acknowledge that we have students that are missing. That's how real this is. And so if you're a teacher, you should be lifting your voice. I don't care what the contract says. Let me just be honest, because we know contracts bind teachers. We got to get out of that. We have seen that if people are not going back to restaurants because they're finding better jobs, teachers, you can find a job that will support you. You can find a school system that will allow you to advocate for your students. But we cannot be silent about our students that are missing, about our teachers that are sick, that our students that don't even have a place to live, and we're not even making sure they have the resources. We can't be silent any longer. And that's how serious this is.
Yeah, I'm really sorry to hear that. I know that's been an issue in Baltimore as well around the mold and the HVAC systems being really old and a lot of the school buildings being really old. And I find that so heartbreaking because the United States of America is the wealthiest country in the world at this moment. And we don't value our children enough to make sure that they have what they need. Yeah, it's heartbreaking. Cierra, I seen you over there doing all the amen and the clapping and everything. Let me bring you on in because I know you have a lot to say on this.
Yes, thank you. Jason, you were singing to my heart. I was doing all of the dance moves and affirmation of what you were sharing, and what you were saying too, Zakiya, about how we don't invest in young people and children in schools because budgets are moral documents, right? We put our money where our mouth is and we see where that's going. Exactly as Jason said, it's being invested in police officers, which we know does not make schools safe. And instead, we could invest those billions of dollars into mental health support.
Right.
And also into art education, as Jason was talking about, near and dear to my heart, because art education is about creativity and critical consciousness building. It disrupts the status quo, and defunding the arts programs actually reinforces hierarchies because we know that arts education programs are oftentimes defunded in low income, predominantly Black and brown communities. But in private schools, in schools that are wealthy and predominantly white schools, they always have these opportunities to create, to be in creativity spaces. And also when it comes to arts education, we live in a patriarchal world that doesn't trust emotions. We try and quantify everything in the purpose of moving away from emotions. And so art actually allows us to tap into a deeper sense of self where we can say, actually, I can dream a new future. I can dream a new world. And the dreaming and creativity that we do both individually and collectively as communities is what can dismantle these harmful structures and systems. So I think people are afraid. People are fearful of what arts education can actually offer us. And also the same thing goes with social emotional learning, because we see that SEL is under attack in the same ways that I'll say, quote unquote, the misinformed way of critical race theory is under attack, because people are afraid, because these conversations disrupt and dismantle the status quo, because when we are able to name and identify oppression, we can dismantle it. And that also comes with knowing ourselves. And we begin the process of unpacking and uncovering who we are and not who society has forced us to be. And so we don't conform to norms when we know who we are and when we can be in deep relationship with each other. And we also move away from the white supremacy tenet of the scarcity mentality. We know that there's enough for us, so we know, therefore, that we don't have to buy into this capitalist, heteropatriarchal society that has tried to make us conform. I'll also say, in regards to this question, that I find myself in a place of both love and frustration, that at the beginning of the pandemic, there were a lot of conversations about reimagining education. So how can we reimagine education?
Right.
And I'm frustrated because it seems as though we have gone right back to the status quo in reopening schools and doing the same thing that
didn't work before.
Been doing. Exactly, that didn't work before. And so I think that there is the kind of learning that we need to do is leaning into community. There are also harmful narratives circulating in a lot of education spaces about quote unquote learning loss that completely disregards the learning that happens every day in communities, in our home places, in our spaces, with communities and with families, with caregivers, with loved ones. And when the education system was not able to serve communities, they turned to community, they turned to organizers, they organize together, they engage in mutual aid. And so how do we create space to support, amplify, and value the expertise of communities in schools? And this is where young people can see themselves and their experiences reflected. I'll say one more quick thing, because Jason was also talking about storytelling, which is so close to the heart. And Sean Ginwright notes an important point about moving from trauma-informed engagement to healing-centered engagement. So offering healing spaces through culturally grounded rituals, learning about ancestors, participating in cultural traditions, studying the rich history of traditions. And so I think about a lesson that I recently did with the young people that I work with. I'll share the link in the chat box about collecting oral history testimonies from loved ones. And so I just created this question, or offered this prompt of, what would you want the world to know about this moment from your loved ones? Because the young people, what they wanted to explore was, if they got to rewrite the history textbook, what would they want to say? And so that was our grounding question for them, collecting these oral history testimonies. And they ultimately took the data from the oral history testimonies. We learned about coding together, we analyzed the data, and then they actually turned that data into artwork that they presented to their loved ones. And so really engaging in lessons that allow us to tap into our communities, into ancestral knowledge, through creative and alternative ways that are moving outside of the standardization that schools often make us conform to.
That's right. That's right. That's really good. Robin, I want to bring you in. Same question. Love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that I worry about is that schools will be focused on, putting in a program, running a survey. What we're finding is that if we're going to be serious about addressing kids' needs, schools need to shift their mindset around this so that they think about a complete marriage between social emotional learning and academic learning. They have to go together. And it can't be a classroom-based solution. It's got to be a whole school solution. The whole school has to commit to having the infrastructure in place, whether it's an SEL coordinator or data collection system, or a way for students to virtually raise their hand and say they need some help, and then something kicks in and addresses those needs. Our schools, I think what we saw during the pandemic was, our schools are not equipped to think about that marriage, and they're generally not equipped to just identify individual needs and address individual needs, and then to orient their learning programs around really addressing the potential of that individual child, the passion of the individual child. So trying to just get schools to just shift along those lines is going to be the work of the next 5 to 10 years. And I agree that, catching kids up should not be the goal. We need to work to something fundamentally better, because if, catching kids up, it was not good enough. And then the other point that I would make is that we've spent a lot of time during the pandemic looking at things like pods and learning hubs, and particularly in places and in communities where folks during the pandemic said, hey, we're going to use this time to do something fundamentally better. We're not going to talk about continuity of learning. We're going to talk about how we can reimagine learning during this time. And so we've seen just some incredible new efforts pop up that were community-led, community solutions. And shame on us if we don't really pursue that and think about how can we not just integrate those into our school systems, but create space for those kinds of pandemic solutions to flourish, whether it's outside public education, the traditional public education system, or integrated. But just to name a few, the Oakland Reach has been incredible. They've shown what's possible when the community just leads on academic and social emotional sides, and they're working with Oakland Public Schools to integrate parent advocates now into the school district, which is cool. The Black Mothers Forum has done really amazing things to step in and say, we're gonna create the meaningful education that our kids need. Just try and stop us. And they are just going and flourishing. My Reflection Matters is a virtual hub among homeschool families of color who want to have really a student-driven, student-owned education for their kids. They're just making it happen. So we need to really, not just talk about how our traditional systems can shift towards something that we imagine is better, but let these kinds of efforts lead us towards something better.
That's really good. No, I think that's right. And I'm familiar with Oakland Reach too. They are doing really good work out there. Jovan, I want to have you an opportunity to answer this question too. What kinds of learning, from your perspective, can schools put in place to support you and your peers?
Well, schools need to get rid of standardized testing and things that have something like the ASVAP B, not PB, which shows the students what to know, what's best to help them, focus on personal learning to prepare us for the real world, bring back home economics with shopping and other trade-based learning, and allow teachers to teach. Yes, they should have a way to track students' progress, but they don't need to do it based on testing mandates.
I like that, and I love the fact that you brought in the trades. I also went to school in the South, I went to school in the South, K through 10th grade, and finished in Ohio. But I remember having home economics in elementary school, and I remember at the time the high schools as well offered different programs that young people could literally get a job right out of high school if they wanted to, or they could choose to go to college. Both were there. And then we hit a bump somewhere where like schools just got rid of all of those things and everything was just about college. And now we have a bunch of people with college degrees who are having a hard time getting a job. And now we have, all these openings for plumbers and carpenters and all these different professions. It's really interesting to see. So I appreciate you bringing that in, Jovan. Cierra, I wanted to come back to you really quickly because you talked about this when you answered this question. I wanted you to maybe share a little bit more. You shepherded a report for Communities for Just Schools Fund called Reclaim SEL. And I'd love for you to just share with the audience a little bit about the thinking that went into that report, and just share, what are the key lessons? We're going to share it in the comments for people to read the full report, but what are some of the key findings and key lessons that came out of that?
Thank you so much for calling me in to share a little bit more about this work. And so the audience knows Zakiya is also in the report and the work with Racial Justice Now. So really excited to uplift that work as well. So for our Reclaim Social Emotional Learning report, we our community of partners, which includes grassroots organizers all throughout North America. So youth organizers, parent, intergenerational, and educator organizers came together over a 2-year span to be in conversation about what is social emotional learning? What does it look like? What does it feel like for communities? And one of the things that we found in exploring this from different experiences, from reading the literature to engaging with different conferences to looking at the research, something that we found is that the most widely used definitions and frameworks of social emotional learning are actually tools of policing. So many of the frameworks and definitions use language like control and manage, essentially meaning that young people have to control and manage themselves. And it places so much of an onus on young people to change rather than actually creating the structural and systemic change needed for young people to lean into their social and emotional skills that they already have, right? So really just building on what they already know intuitively, because social emotional learning, although it is a buzz term, is really about knowledge of self, knowledge of community, being in relationship with self, in relationship with community, with one another, relationship with land, relationship with our ancestors, with our creativities, our hobbies, our joys, our fears, and our pains. And so in this report, and Robin mentioned this, one of the key aspects that we learned about social emotional learning is, one, of course, not using it as a tool to police young people, but also that SEL can't be a checklist. It can't be a series of steps that we take. It can't be an add-on to an already crammed curricula. It actually has to be embedded into the everyday experiences and interactions of folks. And so really leaning into SEL really as a tool of liberation, to liberate ourselves from the society that has policed us into conforming and actually being able to know ourselves on a deeper level. So that report details different case studies and anecdotes from community organizers and the work that they're doing, because we learn that organizing is SEL. Organizers are doing SEL in their work every single day, from building bases, meaning building those deep relationships, having social awareness to know what are the issues that you want to create campaigns around, and then being able to think about how you can use your individual and collective gifts and talents to act on those campaigns, to create those actions. And so really this report, we call it a radical report, a RADport, really creates an outline for and examples of what SEL looks like and feels like from community expertise. And so reclaiming SEL from the harmful control and management tactics and frameworks, and actually placing it into what community is sharing with us and has always shared with us, because community has already imagined and reimagined what education should look and feel like as we move towards justice, liberation, and joy.
Yes. Yeah, all the claps for that. And community as experts, what an idea, right? I know that goes against a lot of like our socialization and what we've been kind of like socialized to believe, but communities are absolutely experts on these issues and are closest to the answers to a lot of the things that we're talking about here. So thank you for taking the time to really unpack that. We did share that in the comments with everyone that's watching. Also wanted to just take a moment to just remind everyone that's watching, please make sure you share this. We do welcome your questions. Towards the end of our 90 minutes together today, we'll bring up some of the questions that you all have. So please, if you're listening, drop your questions in the comments, and we'll do our best to get to them. Thanks, Cierra. I'm going to hop to our next question. This one is a two-part question. But what are the lowest hanging fruit, if you will, when it comes to increasing mental health supports in schools? What's most feasible, and where could we go beyond that And what would it take? That's a lot. Robin, I actually want to start with you on that. Love to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. Well, low-hanging fruit. I would say, there's a lot of ways that schools could do better. And, the basics, I think, are just tracking simple data. And I don't mean that in a cold sense, but, there are a lot of great surveys out there, Panorama, Youth Truth, that, you don't want to use them for, I don't think we want to use them for high stakes, accountability or things like that. They really should be used for getting a pulse on what's going on with the students in your building, and watching for early warning signs that some kids are really struggling and making sure that there's a system to step in quickly. I mentioned the kind of virtual raise the hand system that some schools have deployed. And a lot of kids raise their hand when schools offer that kind of opportunity. They want the opportunity to talk to an adult about what's going on with them. So let's do that. And then there are structures that schools can put in place, mentor groups, advisories that really should be part of the school or as an organization and part of the schedule. So, take some time to just check in with kids, know what's going on with them, and give them an opportunity to really voice some ideas as well as voicing, issues that are coming up for them. So those are some simple things. And then, I think the other area for low-hanging fruit is, again, like looking at what just happened during the pandemic. When schools were shut down, communities didn't shut down. They stepped up and they delivered spaces, mentoring, supports for kids that they needed during a really difficult time. And I'm really concerned that now we're just kind of shutting the door to that and saying, thanks for your service. We're going to go back to normal. So really building in those partnerships with churches, after school programs, YMCAs, because they realized we don't have to be just an add-on to schools. We can be an integrating function to help kids really thrive. Oftentimes, those are the folks who know the community, know the kids, can call the auntie or whatever. And so let's get really serious. So to go to your question, where can we take these kinds of ideas? There are a lot of school districts and a lot of communities that are saying, hey, maybe we could create these kind of hubs in the community where kids could go to school for part of their day and have these mentorship kinds of opportunities, or have more career-focused opportunities if we build it into the system. So there's a school district called Edgecombe Public Schools in North Carolina that's talking about doing kind of a hub and spokes model where kids go to their core classes for part of their day, but then they go out into the community and do these kind of specialized programs, which is really cool to think about. So let's leverage those community assets. Let's leverage the relationships and not put it all on schools and certainly not on kids to address all these issues.
I love that. The school district in North Carolina, what was the name again?
Edgecombe.
Edgecombe. I'll look into that.
Yeah, a rural community, so they're trying to figure out.
Rural community. Yeah, that sounds really promising. Jason, I want to come to you. Same question. We'll put the question back up because it's sort of a two-part question. What are the lowest hanging fruit, from your perspective when it comes to increasing mental health supports in schools? What's most feasible? And, where could we go beyond that? And what would it take?
So I'm going to start with a notion that comes from our school leader, Christina Guillen, who's been on TDRS and talked about the importance of showing grace. And that is the lowest hanging fruit right now that is tangible for every person, not just teachers, our educators, our staff members, our leaders, our board members, our parents, our students, our community members. The lowest hanging fruit that we all have access to, that is one of the most important things needed right now for increasing mental health support, not just in our schools, but in our communities, is grace. We have seen violence increase, whether it has been gang violence in our schools, in our communities, domestic violence, as I mentioned earlier, because people are at the end of their ropes. They have felt ignored. They feel pushed out from their jobs. We see the financial and economic inequities that are happening, putting more force, trauma, and mental instability within our fellow neighbors and constituents. And so giving each other grace is it's free, it's powerful, but it's something that everyone can do. I also would say another thing that is feasible for our schools to focus on, again, is holding our school boards accountable. This is what I ask people across our nation. Look at the dollars. I went and studied family engagement under Dr. Karen Mapp, who has been a strong advocate for family engagement. And one of the things that we definitely can improve is making sure that schools are not just focusing on involvement, which is connected to Title I or Title federal dollars that restrict how we can actually provide wraparound services. The listening sessions with parents on healing from losing a loved one, from losing your job or being misplaced. Those type of things are not allowed under Title I. And so if we're really going to push the needle with mental health, we need to make sure that our school boards are investing general funded dollars, our property tax dollars, into engagement that will allow us to provide the support for wraparound services that are needed for each student, for teachers, for staff members, and most importantly, making those partnerships with the community that is done in engagement work. It's not done in the Title I involvement. And I want to keep restating that, because as we're giving each other grace, I want to also get us to solutions. And a solution for fixing how we engage our parents and communities in this healing process, in this work of mental health, is to make sure that we're not isolating them. We have retired educators that are leading nonprofits that are doing this work. Someone mentioned in the comments, we should be going to them. So solutions are there. We know what needs to be done. I'm going to urge everyone to do what you can, which is starting by giving grace, being understanding, listening more before reacting, and then following the money to see, are we actually even investing in doing this adequately? We cannot do this work with a shortage of staff, with a lack of resources, and not having the dollars that are actually allowing us to do the work needed for mental health.
Jason, I love that answer, because it's so simple, but sometimes people can make it so complicated, right? What you talking about when it comes to grace is just normal having empathy, like just, having understanding. We've all been through this pandemic. It's global, right? Like, so that's the lowest of the hanging fruit. And I love that and appreciate you for sharing that. Jovan, I wanted to come to you as well, and just, allow you an opportunity to respond to that question.
For like students need to feel safe and heard by teachers and counselors. But life is hard enough. But now it's worse hearing adults gossiping about students, if personal and sensitive information about them. We need to find a way to incorporate support between the students and their parents, especially ones that are used to dealing with one's emotions and feelings. We need to add meditation. We can add meditation, create gardens, eat real foods, live limits, or eliminate big police presence, and have peer meditators to help work out issues between students. So
I love that. I love that you talked about the peer mediators. That was amazing. Yeah, like listen to the students, y'all. Cierra, love to bring you in for your thoughts as well.
Sure. So I will just plus one everything that everyone has shared. And I think for the educators that are listening in, one thing that's been really effective for me is just something as simple as checking in with young people. I start every session with an opportunity to lean into the Indigenous and African practices of circle keeping to build community, and as an opportunity to just be seen and to be heard, and to ask them questions about themselves and their daily experiences, so that we have that one moment when all else fails, when all else is going awry, that we always have that one moment that we can continue to check in with one another. And I think to answer your question of going beyond that, I've been thinking about a lot how we can't pretend to say we have SEL in schools where there is still harmful disciplinary practices and policies, when there are police in schools. And I'm thinking in places like Mississippi, Nolly Jenkins Family Center has been organizing for years to remove corporal punishment in schools. It still exists in schools. And so we can't say that we have SEL or that we're going to invest in SEL if we're not also removing the practices and policies that are harmful. And also when the curricula is violent, right? When you look at the curricula and it's not culturally affirming, when we don't teach the truth. If we don't have that, then how are we supposed to know ourselves, and how are we supposed to know one another? So really moving to holistic safety, connecting school climate, curricula, social emotional learning policies, and grant programs. And actually, in about 5 minutes today, there's going to be a congressional briefing on the support and supporting the Counseling Not Criminalization Act. So call your members, please call your local representatives and ask them to co-sponsor the Counseling Not Criminalization Act. There are a suite of bills that are moving through the Congress right now, including Protecting Our Students in Schools Act and the Keeping All Students Safe Act. And there are actually historic investments in hiring mental health practitioners, social workers, counselors, school psychologists, and the Counseling Not Criminalization Act would actually remove federal funding from police in schools. And so alongside doing the daily experiences and creating those moments of care and of collective community opportunities, also thinking too at the larger level of removing the harmful infrastructure that continues to deny us opportunities for deeper connection and for safety, and then moving to a federal space where we can organize around some of these bills and this legislation that's moving that would increase funding to go directly towards school districts hiring more mental health supports for young people and for educators and school communities.
Cierra, thank you so much for highlighting that. You're absolutely right. That briefing is today. If we have a link, I'd love for us to share that in the comments. I know that lots of our partners are actually on the Hill. Center for Popular Democracy and others are there. And I think there's going to be a group of students and parents as well, a part of this briefing. So that's absolutely right. We can actually do something about it by, like you said, Cierra, calling our federal elected officials and saying, hey, we really want you to get behind this. So that's literally something we can do that directly tied into this question. I want to we've talked about this a lot here, but I wanted to give us an opportunity to maybe go into it a little bit more and maybe share other things that we had not shared already. And the next question for everyone on the panel is, what could the role of arts in schools do to support the whole child? I feel like Cierra, Jason, you all really talked a lot about that already, but if there's anything else you guys would like to share about that, I'd love to hear it. Maybe we'll start with Jovan. I'll start with you. If you'd like to tell us what role arts could play in supporting you and your peers in schools.
For arts, how it can support us is to rewire neurons in the brain, spark and enhance our creativity, teach life skills. We also connect music with art and other subjects, critically thinking, and so on.
That's right. I love that. Absolutely. Was there anything else, Jason, you wanted to add to that? I mean, I know the situation there in terms of the school district defunding instead of defunding the police, they defunded the arts program. Is there anything else you'd like to add on to convince, maybe if they're listening, how this really supports the whole child and how that we can decrease funding in other areas to ensure that students have access to arts education?
I will say this to echo Jovan's words, that it's the growth mindset, right? It's reaching the whole child. And how are our schools educating the whole child? And so I actually have some other students who are watching us online, and I have them, dropping in the chat what are things that they want to see. And again, multicultural curriculum. This is something that the EdLanta Student Coalition has definitely said that they want to see. I want to shout out two of my students who are from Mexico, Elmer and Fidel, who are hard workers, and they appreciate having me as one of their teachers because I'm intentional about making sure that they're represented in the curriculum that the state of Georgia offers in our public schools. And so when we think about art education, it's also the representation of various cultures that the students are able to connect and see. Jovan mentioned music. And now they also call me DJ Allen because they know that I'll put on jazz music, but then I'll go back through the time and, we'll listen to a little bit of Aerosmith. And it's a vast, right, music catalog that allows the students to connect to what's happening. Again, it's the art of storytelling. And so, of course, I have another resource, the growth mindset. This is something, again, that speaks to what Jovan mentioned around making sure that we're including all aspects of the art to make sure that we're reaching our students and reaching their families. And here's the dynamic with this. We need to make sure that the students are okay, but we all know this too well, that if we're only checking on the students during the hours of school and not really connecting with them after school hours to make sure that parents and families have the resources they need to effectively continue the best practices we're using to reach their children academically, socially, and emotionally, then we're still not serving our children well, and they're still not going to be doing well. And so what I will petition us all to do is to make sure that our school leaders are informed. We cannot take for granted that every teacher, every leader knows everything, that they're the guru for social emotional learning. I could tell you as an educator, I know a lot of my colleagues who cannot tell you any best practices around social emotional learning. The growth mindset, we have to change the mindset of our teachers, our leaders, and all of our educators working with our students to ensure that those things that are needed, such as art education, making sure the money is put in places for socialization. Our children need to be able to socialize, and we're seeing this all too well in our society right now with the escalation in crime and violence. It is a mirror of what our students and young people are seeing adults do. If we're not teaching them critical thinking that Jovan mentioned, if we're not teaching them those life skills, that Jovan has also mentioned, then we're going to continue to fail them, and we'll continue to keep asking the question how the students are doing when we know that they're not doing well because we're not doing what needs to be done to make sure that they have the resources needed to be well.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Just love the fact that you always pulling out these resources. You got all the books. You was ready. I appreciate it. Offering some tangible, resources to the folks. So I wanted to bring you up, Robin. I don't know if you guys have done any research at your organization around this, around, sort of like how arts is integral or important to supporting the whole child. But I would love to hear your thoughts on that question as well.
Yeah, I mean, not a lot. This is not my area of expertise. I will speak
Sure.
More as a parent, I guess. I've got two kids who are musicians, and music heals, arts heal. And so when we talk about healing, when we talk about the things that we know matter for kids, socialization, as Jason mentioned, arts is just such a low-hanging fruit opportunity for us. It's easy to pull off, especially if we leverage the community and bring them in and get serious about building those connections. So why wouldn't we want to do it? It just seemed like an obvious.
Yeah, absolutely. Cierra?
Sure. So I'll share a little bit from my own personal research that I've gotten to do with the young people who I call my co-researchers. And one of my co-researchers said about her own experience, she said that art makes me feel like myself. And another one said, it helps me say what needs to be said without necessarily having to say it. And I just thought that those two quotes that they shared with me were just so brilliant about the power of what arts offers us in terms of really leaning deeply into self-exploration and self-knowledge. And one of the things too that I found in my research is that art really taps into the Ghanaian principle of Sankofa, the idea go back and get it, being in tune with our ancestors so we know who we are in the present, and then so we can dream forward a new future together. Particularly for Black, Brown, and Indigenous young people, art is a practice of what Cynthia Dillard calls remembering. So schools are oftentimes sites of socialization, and in a sense that they are sites of conformity, right? So making you forget these pivotal aspects, these critical aspects of who we are and who our ancestors and who our communities are, in order to be accepted. And so really remembering those ancestral practices and remembering the teachings of communities and ancestors. And then I'll also share a quick lesson that I did with young people as well around storytelling and arts-based work and counter narrative. So I do teach my students critical race theory, and I'll name that publicly any and every day, any and every second. We actually do learn about critical race theory and particularly the tenet of counter storytelling. And so they created counter narrative portraits where they drew half how they view themselves and half how society views them. And one of my co-researchers drew herself. She was wearing a shirt that said "Love is love." Her eyes are closed. She's listening to music. She's in her zone. And then around it is all of these negative things that people have told her in society, whether it be from an education space or just in different places and spaces. But those words never actually touched her body in the picture that she drew. And when she described it to us, she said that she was just unbothered. She was physically depicting herself as being unbothered as a counter narrative to speak back to the negative narratives that she had received as a person. So she was really able to speak back to it, and how powerful it is to use art as a tool as a naming practice, to be able to name ourselves in the world. And then one last thing that I'll mention that I really love, leaning into somatics and thinking about accessible movement, because especially as we're having a conversation about leaning into healing-centered engagements and social emotional learning and social emotional health, how critical it is to acknowledge that our bodies hold stress, and being able to create spaces where we actually release that. So thinking about ways to incorporate that as part of our daily practices in schools and also outside of schools as well. And I'll share another resource in the chat. Village of Wisdom has a racial stress coping plan, and in it asks really critical questions that I think are just so advantageous to asking whether you're at home or whether you're in school. And it's just a great resource to lean into the different ways that we might notice and observe our emotions and where we're carrying them and how we're carrying them in our body, because our health is holistic. So thinking about the ways to really intersect and marry those different parts of ourselves. So I'll share that as a resource in the chat.
Thank you so much. And that is so true. I'm so glad you brought up the idea of somatics. That's something that was a new concept to me a couple of years ago. Just like yoga and like, I'm weird. I mean, at first I was like, because as an organizer, and this was like in my early organizing years, because I'm like, we're in an emergency, like nobody has time for all this other stuff. I can't imagine Harriet Tubman talking about she need to do some yoga before she free the people. But now it's like, but it's like now, especially since I've had like physical sickness actually like manifest in my body. You're right. It's all connected, Cierra. And it took me experiencing that a couple of years ago too, like to realize, you know what? None of our people who ultimately became martyrs, they didn't like that. They didn't want that. The conditions at the time made it that way for them. And like, I had to like think to myself, like, it's okay, right, to take a break and to take care, of myself. And I think it was Audre Lorde that says that something that is radical or revolutionary, like to take care of yourself. You shouldn't feel bad about that. So I appreciate tools can even be bringing in meditation and things like that to offer that as coping and to, support the whole child.
And I'm so glad that you said that particular thing, because the young people that I work with were so interested in the concepts of like radical self-love, self-care, community care. So we did an exploration of the Black Panther Party, and
like they used acupuncture.
Yes, Angela Davis, Erica Huggins, when they were imprisoned, they used meditation and yoga as a tool. And I have Mrs. Rosa Parks right here with me always, who also engaged in the practice of yoga. And so I think about just like the radical revolutionaries, if they can lean into those aspects of care,
that's right.
How we can look to them, how we can look to that ancestral knowledge to be able to take care of ourselves as well. So that excites me that you mentioned.
Absolutely. No, I appreciate that. I was actually really happy to learn that a lot of the Black Panthers also used acupuncture, and they also use that for folks who are struggling with addiction. And it was very, very effective to help people come out of addiction. So all of this stuff, it's real. Well, I wanted to get in this last question, and then we do have a few questions in the chat that I want to try to bring up. So the last questions really quickly, you can offer a response to this. Could measuring students' SEL and other skills help schools improve? Overall. So I mean, that's academically and all the ways that we tend to quantify things. Do you believe that if we were measuring and implementing SEL, schools could improve with that? I'll come to you first, Robin.
I mean, I've talked a lot about, surveys and things that schools are using. And I think it's really important. I will say, as a qualifier, that some surveys are better than others,
Sure.
So it's treading carefully in this area. And, as I take a step back from schools and I think about, how will we know if kids are getting what they need? I also think it's important for us to kind of measure at the school level what's going on, and for people outside the school to know through transparency, how kids are doing, if their needs are being addressed. And so I do think it's an important area, and there are some really cool measures popping up that we reference in some of the reports that we've been putting out. But there are opportunity to learn measures that aren't measuring student needs directly, but are kind of looking at the contextual factors, and those can include in relationships and stuff like that. But they can also include measures of exposure to racism and stressors in the home and things. And I'll say too, just lastly, that it's also worth, and some of you have mentioned, but educators are stressed out right now too, and we need to know what's going on with them. So but tread carefully.
Yeah, I like that. Jason, same question.
So I'm smiling because I do have a resource.
I know you do. Come on, bring it.
I want to share. And it's so important, right? Because one of the things as I'm studying special education and getting my master's is that there's a big conversation around assessments and how we are actually assessing what's working. And one of the things that we're missing is, and you probably don't hear a lot of people talk about this data, is inclusive teaching in education.
Yeah.
And I'm so baffled, and this is why I'm smiling, because it's almost like we're never going to get it right until we focus on the best practices that actually work. And we still have a separation in our schools of general education and special education. But it's research-based that shows that inclusive teaching, having a special educator and someone who generalizes or specializes in their content area in the same classroom.
Well, they do that in my kids' school district. They're not doing that in Atlanta?
Now, let me say that my school is Seven Pillars Career Academy. Is doing it because Ms. Guillen would smack my hand and say, now, Jason, you're doing it. So we are doing it. However, overall in the city of Atlanta, no, we are not. And inclusive teaching and co-teaching does work. I'm speaking as a special education teacher that's saying, yes, it works. But also when I started education in the general classroom and general population, and it worked then. So this is how I know it works. My former principal gave me this book, Assessment in Special and Inclusive Education. This book is over This book is over 12 years old. However, it's a resource that I'm actually using in my program right now because it speaks to what we're not getting right. And it actually says in this book, and I will tell you the page, if y'all just give me 4 more seconds on my response. It talks about the reluctance of No Child Left Behind on page 173. This is probably the nerd in me too, in the very first paragraph. And it highlights how we focus on standardized and high stakes testing, but we forgot to assess the well-being of our children and our teachers. And we're not going to be successful until we do that. And so here's what I would say. We need to make sure that we have the right educational leaders that understand inclusive learning, because if we don't, when we don't, we're going to continue to fail children. And so if you're an educator, if you are a parent, here is a great book. Ask your school leaders, have you received, in my light, it may be a little bit off, assessment in special and inclusive education. And special education, also, let me say this, it connects to accelerated learners, those who are gifted and talented. Let's not also forget that they are on the spectrum too, and I'm dual exceptional. So I can tell you that a lot of times we miss our children who are gifted and talented because we only focus on, the behavioral issues that
happens all the time
down in special education. And I can tell you this, last point, I have 6 young men who are autistic. I have students that have double hearing aids, that have all types of exceptionalities, and they're all making progress on their goals. And I'm one teacher supporting several other teachers in my building. So if it can be done, and I'm seeing it in my classroom, then we should be seeing it across classrooms, not just in Atlanta, but across our nation. So again, the book is Assessment in Special Education. It is the 13th edition. Yes, there is a 30th edition, a 25th. However, the 13th edition is the one that has the resources in it. So please check that out and be knowledgeable, about what strategies can be implemented to make sure that we're meeting the needs of all of our children, especially when it comes to assessing them, especially when it comes to social emotional learning, literacy, which is a major thing that has a huge deficit on the weight of how we're actually implementing plans and assessing data.
I love that, Jason. I love the fact that you're an educator that truly believes in continuing education, and you're doing it on your own. Nobody has to give you a certificate that you did it. So I love that. And thank you for sharing all these resources. I'm sure the people who are listening are probably taking notes. Jovan, yes, I want to come to you and same question and get your thoughts. Could measuring students' social emotional learning help improve schools for you and your peers?
Well, as long as the measuring doesn't cause damage to the students, I agree with SEL and other skills should be measured. The resources and support a student has, the better the engagement in academic. Improve that can be seen, but this improvement could help the climate of school to be safe and fun while helping them grant and funding to continue support us.
Awesome. Thank you. Cierra, final thoughts on this question.
Sure. So I'm going to offer similar caveats as the rest of the panelists. I think that we have to be careful about how we're defining measurement, particularly in SEL. I think that in a lot of conversations about research and assessment, there is very much this idea that evidence-based is being used as a gatekeeping tool of what type of knowledge is valued and from who is it valued. So I fear that with many things in education that there will be a push for standardization in something like SEL that is so personal and that is so fluid and nuanced and complex. And we see this now. There are a lot of studies that are coming out that outline which SEL curricula is what I'll say is like the best bang for your buck, essentially reinforcing that SEL is a capitalist project rather than an actual opportunity for liberatory exploration. So I would invite people to be creative in their thought processes around measurement and SEL, like getting feedback from parents and caregivers and young people through arts-based methodologies, asking them to, if they might be interested in engaging in arts-based methodologies to think about their social emotional learning, using participatory methodologies like participatory action research, and having community really be involved in in these practices and asking them what they would like to see as part of measurement. And then I think that we also have to act on those. If we are going to invite community into assessment, we actually have to take their feedback and act on it, because it's irresponsible to say, oh, let's do this together. Let's be a community. Let's assess and engage in measurement together, but not actually ever implement what communities are asking for. So we have to make the changes, and that requires some deeply shifting work and shifting the ways that we do things, and really beginning and continuing to disrupt the status quo in our measurement and assessment processes.
I love that. That's absolutely right. I can't tell you how many times I've been engaged as a parent, and then the school or whoever proceeds right on, right? Like they check it off. Okay, yeah, we engage the parents, but then never like actually implement our thoughts, our ideas, or any of that. So I love the fact that you center that in your response. That happens all the time. Like people will check off a box. Yeah, we engage the parents, and then go on and do whatever it is that they wanted to do in the first place. So cool. We have about 10 more minutes together. This is the time we want to turn to our audience questions. We have a couple of questions that we want to pull up here. And it looks like I have one that was directed right for you, Robin, from Maureen. She wanted she said here, could you talk about how we can bring in these kinds of staff while keeping an eye on the bottom line? Seems like she might have been responding to something you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, well, I think I can guess, and Maureen can correct me if I'm wrong, but there is a surge in spending right now because we have all these dollars coming in from the federal government, and it's great because the kids really need extra supports. But I think the concern is that money will go away eventually. Mm-hmm. And then what? And so I really encourage schools and school districts and communities that want to have influence over what's going on to start thinking now about how to really kind of prioritize what kinds of investments are being made and start having conversations about what are the things that should last beyond the pandemic and how are they going to be paid for. And so I also get concerned that if we stay in the box of what we know and we just, hire more counselors who may or may not have as much expertise as folks in the community, then we're getting ourselves into trouble. And so looking at that permeability of expertise and saying, how can we build for durable change now? So, these pods and hubs and like creative structures for melding community with schools seem like a really cool place to focus our attention, but also just being really serious about setting priorities and learning right now about what works so we can carry that forward.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Looks like we have a question for you, Jovan, and it says, what is the most useful learning you are getting in school?
Ooh, that's a good question. Okay.
Yeah.
What's the most useful learning?
Yeah.
Well, if we're talking about learning skills, what they teach us to do is more likely, if we don't understand it, we ask like the teacher, they break it down furthermore, and if we still don't get it, they show examples, and then we can try and follow the example in our own version of the equation or math, writing, whatever. But they more likely want us to keep it hands-on, so we're able to get a better grasp upon what it is.
That's awesome. I love the fact that you talked about like the hands-on piece.
Yeah.
One of my children is actually, both of my children are very much kinesthetic. So that whole like hands-on experiential kind of learning, both of them really lean into that. So I appreciate you sharing that. One more question from the audience, and this looks like it's for everybody, so it's not directed towards just one person. Says, how do we do this data work without penalizing students, as we talked about in last week's data session? So people who were with us last week, we talked about data a lot. Cierra, I want to come to you because I would just love to hear what your thoughts are on that.
Thank you. So the first thing that comes to mind for me is that oftentimes in this type of data, we see data standardization grades as almost like a final stop rather than this work being a journey, and particularly with something that is so personal, like social emotional learning, and even with content, right? Even in some of our content courses, of thinking beyond just that knowledge base for just one day on that one test, but rather encouraging lifelong learning. And that's why I think arts-based methodologies are really critical in this type of work, because there is a spaciousness to be able to interpret it and allow people to use that as a starting point for themselves to say, oh, this is what I'm thinking about, or this is what I'm getting out of this. Rather than it just being an endpoint. So really thinking more so about data as a journey, and thinking about these processes as a journey, and being a lifelong learner, a lifelong explorer of yourself and of the world around you. Because when we confine it to only being one moment, then it oftentimes becomes that penalizing, that policing. And especially with something like social emotional learning, I know there's a lot of surveys and a lot of data tools. And the way that I'll use myself as a personal example, the way that I feel about myself, maybe in 5 minutes will be a little bit different than I feel right now, or tomorrow I'm going to feel different, right? And so really thinking about how to create a spaciousness for the nuance, the complexity that really sees this as a continuous process rather than there being stopping points.
No, I think that's a good point. Anybody else wanted to take a stab at that question? The question.
I would definitely say, I've actually put this in the comments, but we need to invest more in the community partnership aspect. And we are receiving a lot of funds. I used to work in the Office of Federal Grants and Programs in Atlanta Public Schools, and I learned so much around the Title I dollars. A shout out to the woke aunties and mothers of the movement who are so well versed in this, and we have such long conversations around what needs to be done. Federal dollars have so many restrictions, and they really don't allow for the work to be done in the way it needs to be. However, we have to have the right leadership in place. I think about Miss Dina Davis. She was the first Black principal at Morningside Elementary School in the city of Atlanta. She recently passed away, and she helped to integrate Spring Street. And her daughter, in talking to my family, my dad did her funeral program. I always have something near me, right? And her daughter talked about how even in the early 70s, late 60s, her mom was a catalyst for social emotional learning and making sure that the well-being of our children and our staff members was being put first. And she learned ways to navigate the funding pots of how we can make these things work collaboratively. And she made the connections with organizations in the community. And we're doing that work right now, but it's not widespread. In my school, we have a partnership with Young Men Rising. They're actually at the school right now working with the group of our young men. These are retired veterans. Who better than to support us with social emotional learning than those who have actually gone through trauma? And we have women of the military and health fields that are coming in and volunteering to help us bridge that gap, because they understand trauma in a different lens. And so it does two things. It helps us reach the needs of our students and our families, but it also heals them too. And so it's our way of giving back to the community. And I mentioned Miss Davis because she was so intricate in doing that. Even when the funding wasn't there, she made it happen. And so that's what I would encourage everyone to do. Even when the funding doesn't align to the critical work of social emotional learning, we have to make it happen, and we have to have the right leaders in place who understand what that work looks like and how to get it done.
Oh, I love that. Thank you so much. There is maybe one final question, and we can do a quick round on this one if you'd like. It says, what should last beyond the pandemic? How should we pay for it? And also, to Cierra's point, what other expenses should we shift away from, like policing schools and policing strategies in schools? We got 2 minutes. Anybody can jump in on that one. It wasn't directed towards just one person.
Okay, I'll start. Okay. I will definitely say that School resource officers are needed. We don't need as many, and we don't need extreme budgets of $2.5 million to get the work done. I believe that we can do that with less funds, again, by making partnerships in the community and vitalizing, things that we know are essential, but can be done in partnership with others. I'm going to continue to say partnership because even with the National Parents Union, the NPU, they have done a recent survey, and engagement is one of the number one things that is preventing us from actually doing this work efficiently. And so understanding that the dynamic work and standards of family engagement will allow us to identify areas such as social emotional learning, such as family engagement. A lot of people don't understand that family engagement actually is the umbrella that brings all of these things together. And so if we shift money to early learning, but not to engaging families, we're still at a fault. And so I'm a big advocate for making sure that we are funding family engagement so that we are reaching our families with social emotional learning, early learning, and those strategies. We're reaching them with literacy, but we're also reaching them with workforce development and those critical life skills that should start as early as elementary. And so these are actual standards of family engagement. You have to check out Dr. Karen Mapp's website at the College of Education at Harvard. It is phenomenal work. It does work when we're intentional about making sure the plans are in place. And so I think that was 1 minute and maybe 16 seconds.
No, I appreciate that. That was a great way to end off this dynamic program. This has been really good. Thank you, Robin. Thank you, Cierra. Jovan, thank you so much. I'm glad you were able to join us today from school. And Jason, thank you. This has been a very good conversation. I think all of our listeners got a lot out of it. Certainly a lot of resources in this one. This was a resource-packed virtual town hall, so I love that. And just want to thank everyone who's been with us for the entire month of October for these Seeking Common Ground town halls. You can continue to follow us at Citizen Ed on all of your social platforms, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter for more information. Building Power with me, your host, Zakiya Sankara-Jabar, will be back next week. I am interviewing Professor Mark Warren from University of Massachusetts at Boston, and we're talking about his new book, Willful Defiance. So make sure you join us next week, same place, same time, Wednesdays at noon. Thank you, everybody. Take care. Goodbye.